Everyone for tuning in tonight, 7 p.m. on a Wednesday. We appreciate your time. We've started a series of webinar a couple of months ago with New South Wales Try, and the idea is to bring you some guests and speakers that we believe would add value to your training life. And I think it's fair to say that when it comes to triathlon, nutrition is one of those topics that can go really either way. You can sort of nail it or you can fail it a big time. And I think tonight we're gonna uncover um some key tips that Scott has put together that really will be crucial. Obviously we're in a big racing week this week with Ironman 70.3 in Port Macquarie. I'm actually myself in Port Macquarie, rainy Port Macquarie this afternoon or this evening. So yeah, there's a big race coming up, obviously, two big races this weekend, but we also have club champs only a few weeks away. So very different, race durations. But we do believe that, what you can do for your nutrition from a short race perspective or a long race perspective, can make or break basically your results. So this is what tonight we wanted to spend a bit of time with Scott and talk about nutrition, but also the platform that he's created. He's a co-founder of Fuelin, and we're going to run you through what Fuelin does and why it's an amazing platform. And then a bit later, so we'll have questions for you guys to ask Scott, and we'll also have Joel Woodridge that's joining us tonight. Joel is a proud member of the Sydney Giants, one of the Sydney clubs that we have part of the New South Wales networks of clubs. Joel actually just came back from Taiwan. We successfully placed third at Challenge Taiwan, which is an awesome result for him. So congrats on that one. So we'll hear from Joel about how he's been using the Fueling platform and how, if he has any nutrition tips for us to share with you all. So should be a fun evening. We're looking at about probably 40 to 45 minutes of conversation and plenty of time for questions and Q&A at the end. So let's get starting. So just maybe for a bit of context, Scott, on who you are and what you've done. I mentioned that you're the co-founder of Fuelin, but you're also an expert in that nutrition domain. You've got over 20 plus years of experience working with pro athletes, and we're going to talk about this with Fuelin and the athletes that you sort of look after on a global scale. But so you've got a degree, a master's degree in sports medicine and then a diploma in performance nutrition. Is that right?
Yeah, and I have an undergraduate in physiotherapy as well. So,
That's
um,
that's in
anyway,
addition.
look, and I appreciate this. Look, I think first and foremost, I want to just say thank you to all the athletes for giving up Wednesday nights, 7 o'clock. It's never easy, and it's always a hard sort of task to nail everyone down. Oh, I can't. Why can't I see those people? Um, but what I want to get through here. Obviously, look, I will give a tiny little bit of background about who I am and what we do as a company, but tonight is very much geared towards you getting some very practical information that we use with professional and age group athletes. Um, the reason Jan is on this slide is because I actually worked with Jan last year and I was part of the team that won this very important race in his career because he wanted to finish on top on the podium. So it was an absolute, probably a career highlight for me. Even though I have worked in many differing sports, Jan is a legend of the sport, and he's also recently joined Fuelin as what we call the Chief Performance Officer because he believes so strongly in what we're doing with nutrition and triathletes. So that's sort of where that sits. Let me go forward. I'm just going to see if I can let these people in. I'm Tom. I might
Yeah,
make you a co-host and you
sure.
can let those people in. Okay, you should be able to let those people in now. Is that all right?
No, no problem.
You got it? Okay.
Yeah, I will do that now.
Cool. Okay. So look, as I said, we'll do a very short introduction, but this is all about providing you with a significant amount of information in a very short space of time that hopefully allows you to go away with something that can hopefully improve your race performance. So in terms of just a quick one on who we are, yes, it is an iOS app that you can download and use as either an automated fashion, or you can work with coaches. From left to right, Dr. Alan McCubbin, who is a fellow of Sports Dietitian Australia. He's a registered dietitian and a lecturer at Monash University. Great individual, works with the Olympic tri team in previous campaigns and also with the recent one coming up into Paris. Megan Foley is a professional triathlete and also a registered dietitian. She's based in Utah in America. Myself, co-founder. Tom's already given you a bit of background about me and the athletes that I work with. And then we have Elizabeth Impen, who is a
Oh, we can't hear you, Scott. Sorry.
Sorry, you couldn't hear me.
No,
Could you
we
hear
did.
any of that?
We did. We were just
Oh,
when
I
you
think you
after
mute.
Elizabeth.
Okay.
Elizabeth.
Okay, so Elizabeth is a coach and she's based in San Diego in America. So all the coaches are available for coaching, but there is, of course, the program, which, as you've seen, Joel, oh God, there. Joel uses, which is an iOS app. Look, at the end of the day, this was built because I saw a major issue in the way that nutrition is delivered to athletes, not just triathletes, generally in the form of spreadsheets, which is how I used to do it as well. So the pillars of the program is there. It's simple, it's very personalized, and it's results driven. The biggest difference that what we do is that we sync directly with an athlete's training program. So if you use TriDot, Training Peaks, or Final Surge, you can sync directly with your training program with us. So that delivers a very personal nutrition program. We also now have the ability that an athlete can build their training program, as in their calendar within Fuelin, and then we can deliver that nutrition program as well. I'm not going to go through all of it, but end of the day, that's the program. There's a screenshot on the left that gives you an indication how it delivers the information. And Joel and I will talk about that later on. So if we get into the race, okay, and the week leading up into the race, and I know Tom's going to ask some questions here. This is probably how we start to think about it. Now, obviously, with the professional athletes that we work with, we're obviously targeting races more than 12 weeks out. But for a lot of athletes, there still is going to be that sort of a mesocycle where you're starting to think, okay, how far out am I from the race and what am I starting to think about? So if we start on the left and we're thinking 12 to 6 weeks out, this is when you're going to start to build the foundation of your program. And I think one of the key areas and one of the key mistakes that a lot of athletes make, and what we see, is that they disassociate training from the race preparation. The way in which you need to thrive and the way in which our professional and elite and age group and novice athletes thrive is by understanding and sort of turning on that light bulb moment that what you do in training is ultimately going to become your race fueling plan. And I really want to emphasize that. So it's not every session, but it is going to be the sessions that are deemed either zone 3 or above or race pace or above. They're going to be the sessions that require higher carbohydrate fueling in training. And that higher carb training is what's going to improve your ability to tolerate high amounts of carbohydrates. It's going to build the foundation of what your race fueling plan is going to be. It's also going to build the plan or the foundation for what your race hydration plan is. So what I really want to emphasize is that getting someone to write your race day nutrition plan is an absolute waste of time. And I am happy to stand by that. Someone writing that plan, that is not personalized, and it is not going to it's not going to get you the results that you would get if you built out your own race nutrition plan by systematically practicing your race fueling in the key sessions in the build up to the race. Okay. And I know I'm being very firm on that, but that is how I speak with people like Jan and Holly and Sky and people like that. And that's what builds the results. Okay. So 12 to 6 weeks out or 6 to 12 weeks out, we emphasize a thing called multiple sweat rate testing. So this is simply, and you can do it without even the use of something like Fuelin, but you weigh yourself before the session and you weigh yourself after the session. Obviously, within Fuelin, we do all the nice calculations for you, but you can use something like Precision Hydration, who is a partner for us, and they have a nice little calculator on their website where you can add that information in. What we also have, and what we would also stress, is that multiple carbohydrate testing or gut training. This is where you start to document how much carbohydrates you're consuming in these appropriate sessions and starting to work out the grams per hour that you're able to consume. And yes, the grams per hour is important in terms of total energy intake, but it's also important to understand which products that you can use and you can tolerate, that are palatable, and you can consume in amounts that actually provide you with the required amount of energy to fuel not just the bike, but obviously feel very good and come off onto the run and not have any GI issues. And I'll talk a little bit more about the carbohydrate testing probably with Joel and give some specific examples of that. The other thing that's really important, and this is a talk if you've got a coach, is thinking about race simulations, in particular brick sessions. So it's all well and good to take in large amounts of carbohydrate on the bike. Certainly a lot of people will, and they'll consume it in liquid form. But if you don't do that and then have a fairly extensive run off the bike, depending on what type of race you're doing, if it's a 70.3 or an Ironman, for a 70.3, we'd be thinking something like a 60 to 90 minute run off the bike. For an Ironman, you might be doing something like anywhere from 60 to 120 minutes off the bike. And they are long, but what you're practicing is the ability to tolerate high amounts of carbohydrates on the bike and high amounts of carbohydrates on the run. And in doing that, you're actually building out your race plan and obviously weighing yourself before and after those sessions to understand what your hydration requirements are. Tom, do you have any questions just based on that 6
No,
to 12
no,
weeks
no,
out, what
not
I've
yet. That
discussed?
no, that's no, that was
It's all
very
right?
comprehensive. Yeah,
Okay.
perfect.
Okay. So then we move into 6 to 2 weeks out. And this is again, you look at it and you go, okay, well, it's pretty similar. These are when maybe a bit more specific, those race simulations, those brick sessions, you might have a shorter runoff, but the intensity is there. And maybe it's a shorter bike, but a longer run. And I really like to see that. I like to see longer runs off the bike because that's where most people get their GI distress. And I know it's talked about like, yes, the mechanical loading, and that's what causes a lot of mechanical stress. Alan and I were discussing this the other day, and our thinking around this, based on some of the research that's out there, it's not so much the mechanical loading from running and the bumping and all that. It's just that people don't practice it. So if you practice something, you get better at it. And yes, it's not always going to be perfect when you first do it, but that's okay. It's okay to be uncomfortable. It's okay to have some GI distress, some burping, some farting. Maybe you will throw up. That doesn't mean you shouldn't try it again. It's a bit like riding a bike. And Alan gave a really lovely analogy that he was like, the first time you did the bike session, it was a little bit hard and you got a little bit sore. Did you say, oh, I'm never doing that again because that was a little tough? It's the same with nutrition. You have to challenge your body with the fuel that you're going to be doing repetitively in order for that to improve. And we know that through the research, where there hasn't been a lot of research on it, but when they've done repetitive gut training, there has been improvements in the way that the athletes respond to that subjectively and objectively in terms of the amount they can consume and also the way in which they respond to that in terms of GI discomfort. So 6 to 2 weeks out, practice race nutrition setups. This is something that's really important for athletes to remember as well, is that it's all well and good to, be on your Swift or your full gas and riding the bike, and have everything on tables. But if you can't actually fit it into your bottles, into your bento box, and you understand the structure of that, and you're on the open road and you practice that, then when you get to the race situation, you're going to become very unfamiliar and actually probably quite anxious. So practicing that race nutrition setup on the bike is super important, and understanding what you can carry. Hopefully for sprint, Olympic, and 70.3, you should be able to carry absolutely all your nutrition. For Ironman, it often depends. The faster, like the better the athlete, the faster the race, which means actually net you need less fuel to carry, which is a bit ironic. But so the faster athletes can generally do an Ironman without any need for any special needs. If you're in slightly slower category, you might need to rely on special needs to actually restock all your nutrition and then go again. So that is something important to think about. From the run perspective, what you want to be thinking about doing is, and I really love this, and this is what my coach used to do, is set up, you come off the bike, and yes, you may be on the trainer or it might be an open out on the road. You come back, you've got a table set up outside your house and you do out and backs. So it might be 500 meters out and 500 meters back. That's a 1K loop. And then you get your ice, you get your water, you get your gels, you get your Coke, whatever's set up on there, and you practice that. It might be walk through, it might be a 15-second recovery to walk through that station, and then you go again, 500 meters out, 500 meters back. It's a fantastic way to build in, obviously, some strength, endurance, some speed, all that, but also practicing having the nutrition at a set interval. So whether that's every 1K that you're doing it, or every 2Ks or every 3Ks, and you can then practice that based on what your requirements are. Another really important thing to practice, which a lot of athletes, well, first and foremost, they don't do a carbohydrate load correctly, but you want to practice that carbohydrate load correctly. And when we talk about a carbohydrate load, the old way of doing it used to be sort of 5 to 7 days of sort of some depletion and then building up carbohydrates to a set amount over a period of that week leading up. The way in which the research supports it now is you probably only need around 24 hours of a full carbohydrate load, which would be around 8 to 12 grams per kilo body weight of carbohydrates. The days 48 hours before, we generally recommend around 6.5 to 7 grams per kilo body weight for carbohydrate, which a lot of athletes think is a lot of carbohydrates. But when you get into the 8 to 10 to 12 grams per kilo body weight, you realize that that amount is probably just an amount that would sustain a pretty high performing type of athlete. And we can talk more about the intricacies of carbohydrate loading if you want, Tom, after I just get through the next bit, which is practicing your race day breakfast. It still astounds me that athletes, even professional athletes, don't have necessarily a set breakfast that they know that they can eat on race day breakfast, i.e. 3 hours before the start of the race, and feel very comfortable with that, and also know that they're getting somewhere between 2 and 3 grams per kilo body weight of carbohydrates. So again, probably aiming minimum of 100 grams of carbs, anywhere up to 250 grams of carbs in that sort of breakfast, which, yes, you'd aim for the majority to be consumed 3 hours before the start of the swim, but it would be the majority 3 hours before, another block of carbohydrates at around 2 hours, and then the last major top up of carbohydrates around 60 minutes before the start of the race. And I will touch on a little bit more detail about on race day in a minute. But you want to be practicing that. Do you cope well with overnight protein oats? Do you prefer boiled white rice with maple syrup? Do you prefer cornflakes? What is it that you prefer to eat on race day? Feel very comfortable with it. Know that you can eat it and have it with you wherever you go in the world. And that's really important. The other thing to think about, and the final thing, is 6 to 2 weeks out, make sure you order every product that you are going to be using so that you're not scrambling for a product and you're sure as hell not buying products at the race. Because, and the reason I say don't buy products at the race, rule number 1 for racing is don't try anything on race day that you haven't practiced previously. So I do see a lot of athletes at these races purchasing gels and products that they've probably never used before, thinking, oh yeah, I better use this in the race because I've been told that carbohydrates are important. So hopefully what you've done is for at least, minimum of 6 weeks out, but probably stretching it out, you've dialed in your race fueling plan and your race hydration plan so that when you come to sort of 2 weeks out, you know exactly what you're doing in terms of setup on the bike, set up before the swim, set up in T2 to go into the run, and then how you're going to manage your carbohydrates in the run. Tom, any questions from that?
No, I think I'll wait until the next slide, Scott, so we can talk about the sort of 0 to 2 weeks.
Yep, cool. Okay, so 2 to 0 weeks out. You can do what we call a heat protocol. I tend to recommend the heat protocol, even if it's not a hot race. There are some physiological benefits from doing a heat stress protocol. Now, you can do this either through what we call acclimatization, which is actually being in the environment, the hot environment, and practicing in that. Not always appropriate for everyone who does have a day job and isn't a professional athlete and can't go to things like, whether you go to altitude or go into a hot climate. So you can do what we call passive acclimation. Passive acclimation can either be hot water immersion or it can be a sauna protocol. I tend to recommend the hot water immersion, A, because everyone has a bathtub, B, because it's extremely uncomfortable and I think it's good for a little bit of mental resilience. But C, most importantly, it works. And the research around it mainly supports sort of 5 and 10K races, although anecdotally, when we do it with athletes, we know that they cope better in the heat after doing the hot water immersion protocol very quickly. And we use this for all our athletes, but you will generally be in the water for a minimum of 20 minutes, up to 30 minutes. It will be to neck level. You need to keep a thermometer in the bath to keep the temperature at 40 degrees Celsius. You can drink fluids whilst in it. You would typically do this immediately following your last session of the day. That's generally how you do it. Ideally, you have at least 10 sessions in a row, and the consecutive number of sessions is really important. It needs to be consecutive. Ideally 10. You could get away with 6, and there is some research, even as little as 3 consecutive days could have benefits. Those last couple of weeks, obviously, you're probably in a taper, so you're just thinking through your process. Maybe you're doing a few short sessions. Maybe it's some high intensity sessions, and you're just practicing that fine, a little bit of carb intake on the bike and on the run. And the number one thing you don't want to be doing is trying to lose weight in those last couple of weeks. Okay. You are where you're at. Just deal with it. It's not going to make a difference. If you try and lose weight in those last 2 weeks, I can probably guarantee you get sick and then your race is stuffed anyway. Or you go in, you don't get sick, but you're in a caloric deficit because that's how you lose weight. So therefore, you're probably muscle glycogen is going to be depleted. You feel terrible. You get into the race, and yes, you're a couple of kilos lighter or a kilo lighter, but no one cares because you didn't finish. And that's generally how I view weight loss in the last part of the week.
Actually, before we move on to the
Oh, yeah.
next slide, Scott, and thinking a bit out loud here about Port Macquarie and the sort of the weather that some of the athletes on this call will be facing this weekend, sort of rainy and cold, would you have a different approach when it comes to a hot race day in terms of your breakfast, especially on a hot day versus like a colder day? Would you, or that really doesn't matter that much?
Um, Race day breakfast probably wouldn't be impacted too much, although I say that you may reduce the total amount a little bit, just knowing in the heat that you're going to have reduced gastric emptying. That is one of the side
Mhm.
effects of heat. What we're more likely to do in cold weather racing versus hot weather racing is probably adjust where the carbohydrates are coming from. So if
Okay.
you think about hot weather, you're obviously going to be sweating more. And this is why, in terms of sweat rate testing, and this is something we really emphasize with the athletes as well, is doing at least 10 tests on the bike, 10 on the run, 10 on the bike, 10 on the run at temperatures of, around, you say hot, we say 30 degrees, but anywhere from sort of 28 to 30 degrees below that, and certainly above that, especially if you're going to be racing in hot conditions. You need to understand what your sweat rate is in cool conditions versus hot conditions, because if you're going to consume carbohydrates in liquid form, you need to understand what the minimum or the maximum amount of fluids you can attribute to fluids to manage your sweat rate, but also provide you with carbohydrates. So what I mean by that is if you are, let's say your sweat rate is, make it easy. Let's say a liter per hour in cool weather. Okay. So your amount of fluid that you'd probably be aiming for is roughly 700 mils to 800 mils based on a 70 to 80% of that total fluid amount. It can vary from individual to individual. So that would be in the cool weather. So you wouldn't want, potentially you only need 1 bottle or 2 bottles or something like that to get you through the race. Now that 2 bottles may not be enough in terms of total carbohydrates to provide you with the energy required. So you would therefore need either chews or blocks or gels to supplement that carbohydrate amount. You move forward into a very hot race, and your sweat rate may go up to something like 1.5 liters per hour. Okay, now you're going to be probably having slightly more bottles on the bike, or at least thinking about picking up bottles. And if you are having to pick up bottles, again, if they're water that you're picking up, you're going to have to think about where the extra carbs are coming from, or carrying an extra bottle, which again might have some of the extra carbs in it. And so that's where you're thinking about specificity of the environment and how that's going to impact your race fueling and race hydration plan.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, so if we then dial it in a little bit more in terms of pre-race nutrition timeline, pre-race day, we talk about red days, yellow days, green days. Green days means higher carb. Every athlete loves seeing green days because they're like, yes, I get to eat as much as I want. Obviously, 24 hours before, as I said, you would be doing your carbohydrate load. Somewhere between 8 and 12 grams per kilo body weight is a good target. I would definitely recommend for athletes who maybe aren't as fast or have never done a carbohydrate load, go to 8 grams per kilo. It is still a hell of a lot of carbs. And what I want to emphasize here is a carbohydrate load is not a bowl of pasta the night before. It is front loading the day, trying to eat, if you think about like I'm 80 kilos. If I'm aiming for 10 grams per kilo body weight, I'm eating 800 grams of carbs. That is not 800 grams of pasta, that is 800 grams of carbs. So this is where some nutritional knowledge also is important. You need to be thinking about and understanding where all those carbohydrates are coming from. So for me, I prefer boiled white rice. Jan preferred boiled white rice. Holly prefers boiled white rice. You see a bit of a theme there. It's a very effective way of getting in a lot of carbohydrates in an easy to manage format. Now, you can make that rice if you want. I'm not saying rice is the only way. You can certainly eat pasta. I do eat oats. I use maltodextrin, and we use maltodextrin as just a liquid carb as well. But you're trying to eat something that has minimal bulk without really any fiber in it. So you're trying to have minimal fiber in that carbohydrate load. So ultimately, the food choices you're going to be consuming are generally going to be either processed or ultra processed foods or minimal fiber containing foods. So think white products, kids cereal, white bread, white rice. That's shitty kiddies yogurt, like all the things that you think are pretty bad for you, they're probably things that you're going to be consuming on a carb load day. Now, yes, you could argue that is not healthy. The thing you also have to remember is you're about to go and do a significant amount of exercise at a significant intensity, and all of this fuel is going to be burnt up, and you are still going to be in a caloric deficit at the end of the race. Okay. And yes, it may not be healthy in that instance, but I can guarantee you it is going to allow you to perform better on the race day and have zero negative health consequences in the long term, okay? Because you are literally about to use it. The being familiar with what you're doing, again, I want to emphasize, it's no different from everything I've said. You're practicing this carbohydrate load because you need to understand how full you're going to get and what foods serve you best on that day. And you do not want to be practicing that before your first race.
When you say so minimal fiber, just a quick question there before we move to the
What does that
breakfast.
mean?
Yeah, or more like what's the timeline here? Are we talking 24 hours? Are we talking 48 hours? What would be the
I'm talking specifically here about the carbohydrate load. Look, reducing fiber, there's no hard science on it. It's more anecdotal, but typically for athletes, what we'll recommend in the timeline on the app is generally saying probably from, if it was a Saturday race, starting to minimize fiber from Wednesday. Some
Okay.
athletes will start to reduce it from Monday, especially if they have known GI issues and really
Mhm.
struggle. When we say minimal fiber, I mean, you've got to remember as well, most people, I mean, the World Health Organization recommendation for fiber is around 35 to 40 grams per day. I reckon about 2 or 3% of the world actually get that amount in. Okay. So when we look at athletes and we say minimal fiber, for a lot of athletes, it's probably not too dissimilar from what they eat on a regular basis, or it doesn't take too much effort to get that amount of fiber down to, somewhere around that 15 grams. If you're in the 10 to 15 grams on that day, you've done exceedingly well. The reality is you're probably going to be in the sort of 15 to 20 grams of fiber, but that is still a lower amount of fiber relative to what we should be taking in.
Great, awesome. So breakfast, so 2 to 3 hours before the race. So that's your sort of ideal scenario.
Yeah. So typically, what we'll say is your largest part of the breakfast would be eaten. I would recommend 3 hours before the race. Now, again, depending on what athlete you are and what you prefer, I personally prefer, and we do recommend this a lot, taking in some fiber on race day because fiber and carbohydrates have been shown to be heat protective from a gut lining perspective. So when temperature goes up internally, carbohydrates will be the primary source of providing protection to the gut lining and stop the widening in the gut junctions, which can lead to things, larger particles, especially proteins, passing through the gut lining or the gut wall. So carbohydrates are really important. Protein and then fat will be the best sources of those macronutrients that can also have a heat protective sort of impact. I myself, because I want to get some protein in as well on the morning because I'm about to do a long race, I tend to go for overnight protein oats with fruit salad, consumed with toast, boiled eggs. Again, depending on the size of the athlete, will depend on how much food they have to eat in order to hit somewhere between that 2 and 3 grams per kilo of body weight for that race day breakfast. Now, some athletes won't consume that much, and that's perfectly fine. I think we saw the other day, and obviously it's very funny, but that lady who ran, the woman who ran the marathon, didn't eat breakfast before smashing out that marathon. Great. Everyone's going to be saying, oh, you don't need breakfast before doing a marathon. No, that is not the case. It's a rare individual that has done that. I would strongly, especially in the case of Ironman or half Ironman, recommend that you are eating something beforehand. You also have to remember she did that marathon in an incredibly quick time. Most people don't do it in that time.
Quick question here, Scott. I think one of the most difficult things for us triathlete, as opposed to runners that do half marathon and marathon is half marathon and marathon tend to be at you sort of like six to in Australia at least 6 to say 7 a.m. start. Whereas we found that, you look at 70.3 this weekend in Portmark, we're talking about 6:25 start a.m. So that's quite an early start. But then
You're
you
up at
talk
3 in the morning.
yeah, club champs, that's coming up for a lot of athletes on this call. We've actually changed the start time to 9 a.m. And then you take the example of Husky Sprint, that sometimes starts at like 1 p.m. Would you have a sort of a different approach when it comes to, because you may be getting up a bit later, would you sort of have a different approach in terms of your race breakfast or not?
Well, I mean, it's just the timeline. Everything just
Okay.
now of it, like, so it's things like the T100, which we have, like Imogen and Ben and whatnot racing and Holly racing, and obviously you have to then account for that. So they've got like 5:30 starts in Miami, and they had a 3 o'clock start in Singapore. You
Mm,
then say, okay, your main meal, your rate. They may do race day breakfast early in the morning, but they'll eat their typical race day breakfast 3 hours before the start of the race. So they may have other meals before that. So they may have a lighter breakfast, and then we look at the total amount of carbohydrates leading up. They can divvy up that amount of
mm.
carbohydrates too between more meals leading in. So it's an individual preference, but
So
a
basically,
late a
once you have
later
that base,
start, yeah, a later
mm,
start obviously gives you the flexibility to sort of spread it out a little bit more and be comfortable with that intake. You have a 6:30 start, and I remember that at Port, like you're up very early, which means, again, if you think about your carbohydrate load, you need to be finishing that carbohydrate load potentially at like 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening because you're going to try and get to bed by 7:30 in order to try and
mm.
get some sleep before waking up at 3. Now, if you're going to get 800 grams of carbs in on the day before and you've got to finish it by 5, you sure as hell don't want to be trying to eat all that at 5 o'clock in the evening. You're front loading the day, having a very big carbohydrate breakfast. You're using maltodextrin as a fluid to get 100 to 200 grams of carbs in that way. Lunch and another snack is going to be up around 200 300 grams of carbs, and then you're tailing it off as you come to the night. And that's where a lot of athletes make the mistake. They think they need a very big meal in the evening just before the race. I would argue that you're probably better off having a meal of, say, somewhere between 50 and 100 grams of carbs at the very end, which is sort of the final top off, so that you're going to bed not feeling completely stuffed and actually allow you to get to sleep or get some sleep prior to the race.
Mm. I saw a question popping up in the chat, which reminded me of a question I have, and we'll answer yours, Manuel, in a few minutes. But is there any difference between male and female when it comes to the race day breakfast from your experience, or not at all?
No, it's just preference, personal preference.
Okay.
I mean, in terms of the food types, that's going to be personal preference based on dietary preference, any intolerances, allergies, things like that. But no, there doesn't seem to be any difference in that
Okay.
of what is required. The biggest mistake females have made in the past, and when we've looked at research, is that they will base the amount of carbohydrates, especially for a carbohydrate load, as a percentage of total calories that the individual's taking in on the Friday. Now, again, if you have, let's say you have 60% of your total calories as carbohydrates, but your total calorie intake was only 2,000 calories on the day, that 60% of 2,000 calories is actually a very low amount of carbohydrates and not enough to fully load the liver and the muscle glycogen. So don't ever work as a percentage of your total energy intake for carbohydrates when you're talking about a carbohydrate load. Definitely work in grams per kilo of body weight. Just simply times your body weight, times your body weight by 8, 9, 10, 11, or 12, depending on how much you want. And then that is your amount of carbohydrates you're aiming for.
Perfect. Well, we get going.
Yeah,
Conscious of the
yeah.
time. Pre-swim
Yeah, I just
snack.
saw that. I just saw the time.
Yeah.
Pre-swim snack. Look, 60 minutes before, 200 milligrams of caffeine. If you're used to using caffeine, I'm being very specific with a bolus of caffeine. I'm not saying everyone has to take 200 milligrams. I'm saying that's what we often recommend, but it is practiced with, again, top up 50 to 100 grams of carbs, depending on where you're at with the rest of the meal. And then 10 to 15 minutes before the start of the race, this is where we certainly would be recommending 1 to 2 gels, depending if it's a 70.3, Olympic 70.3 or a full Ironman. It makes sense to take in probably 50 grams of carbs, i.e. double gel, before an Ironman swim, in my opinion, because you're about to be out there for somewhere between 50 and an hour and a half, and just sipping on fluids, and then obviously you get going. Okay, some key considerations. I think I've covered all these, so I won't go into it, but it is, look, it is all about the individual. Carbs are king. Make sure you understand your carbohydrate requirements, hydration. Training is where you build your race plan. And I will emphasize that again. Training is where you build your race plan. It's about repetition. Train your gut, train your body to cope with the amount of carbohydrates that you need for your body, and race day simulations are really, really important. Again, just really emphasizing this, race day ready in 5 steps. Reduce fiber intake, yeah, at least 24 hours before. Reduce your vegetable intake. You do not need to be eating salads and vegetables 24 hours before. Practice it. Morning breakfast, I recommend including fiber, certainly aiming for that 2 to 3 grams per kilo body weight. Again, practice. Carb loading, 24 hours before is all that's required. 8 to 12 grams per kilo body weight. Practice it. Hydration, you should certainly be peeing clear. Electrolytes, not going to go into it too much. Yes, you can use them. Understand how much sodium you need. You may not need as much as what you think, but it's certainly important to be using electrolytes if you require them. And things like FODMAPs. FODMAPs are types of carbohydrates, fermentable, oligosaccharide, disaccharides, and polyols. These are very good for you, but for some individuals, they do cause some GI distress. If you have known FODMAPs, things like garlic or onion, you may want to consider reducing those as you reduce total fiber intake, because that can cause some GI discomfort, especially if you're an individual who suffers from a lot of GI distress on race day and in the weeks leading up. FODMAPs is one of those very interesting areas where you could benefit from having an exclusion type diet for a period of time and then working with someone to overcome that. And I guess just key takeaways. Look, being race ready takes practice. And I've said that word so many times tonight, but it takes practice. Once is never enough. And nutrition is no different from training. The first time you got on the bike, you were not good. First time you went running, you probably weren't that good. The first time you consume 60 grams of carbs, it probably won't be that comfortable. The first time you consume 90 grams of carbs, you certainly probably won't like it. But with practice, you can certainly improve your tolerance and your ability to take on more carbohydrates. Work on your weaknesses, be Arnie Schwarzenegger. If you got a weakness, expose it, look at it every day, and don't shy away from it. But just be patient, be organized. Best athletes in the world. It's all about organization. If you want to listen, Jan and I did a brief YouTube video recently, and he talks about what we were doing with Fuelin. We're certainly going to talk more about how he did it. You're listening to the guy who's regarded as the greatest of all time, and he did all this stuff. If it's good enough for him, if it's good enough for Holly Lawrence, if it's good enough for Sky Munch, Imogen Simmons, Ben Canute, I can guarantee you it's good enough for you. It just requires a bit of practice and a bit of patience. And that's exactly what it is. It takes time and effort, but that's nutrition. Okay. It does take time and effort. There's no fad diets. There's no secrets to improving your ability to take in more carbs and that. It just takes time and practice. We will go into some
Question.
questions. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I just wanted to emphasize, we did, and I didn't tell you, Tom, but we did do a code. If people do want to have a look at Fuelin, you can use that New South Wales Try 30. That is going to be a limited offer. I think it expires in a week's time, but that gives you 30% off any of the programs on Fuelin. So that's there if any of people want to use it, and you can share
Right.
that.
And we'll share that at the end and the
Cool.
slides if that's okay. But before we hear from Joel and actually myself and you, Scott, about the platform and share a bit more intel about it, it would be great to have some of you participants to jump and ask any questions. If you could please say your name first and the club you're coming from, that would be awesome. And then ask the question to Scott. Is it anyone keen to ask a question? So we had one about menstrual cycle, Scott. Does it
Yep.
affect the plan for race week from a nutrition perspective? So if
No. No,
okay,
unfortunately, you have no control over your menstrual cycle. So, if you want to go down the route of cycling, so yes, I understand there are people who talk about this and talk about the impact that the menstrual cycle, and yes, from a physiological perspective, the female cycle will have some impact on the way in which fat and carbohydrates are utilized. However, when it comes to the studies that show does it have a performance impact, it has zero. If you want to go down that route, it is more driven by the training intensity that your coach is giving you. And if you are in the luteal phase and you want to try that type of nutrition and training, then in the luteal phase, all the training would be lower intensity, and therefore you would be using lower amounts of carbohydrates and potentially higher amounts of fats to provide the total calories. The argument against that is that you don't have control when your cycle and how that's going to play out with races, or sorry, the races that you're entering, unless you're being very fastidious about it, they're going to fall potentially in the luteal phase or the follicular phase. And so ultimately, you need to be comfortable consuming higher amounts of carbohydrates. And we know that if you get to a significant amount of carbohydrate intake and load the muscle glycogen and liver appropriately, even in the follicular phase, you will be able to utilize it enough. So our argument at this point in time is that, yes, there are physiological differences, and it is very interesting science, but from a practical standpoint, we would not recommend that you go down changing nutrition based on your menstrual cycle.
right. Thank you. Next question, we've got Ben from ITC, which I assume would be Inverell or Illawarra Tri Club. Are we trying to consume as many carbs per hour as possible, or 2 grams per kilo is the maximum tolerable? Also, are we preloading with sodium? So it's sort of a dual question there for you.
Are you talking about racing? Where is that question? I
I'm
saw it, Ben.
assuming that's on the race day, yeah.
But are you talking about leading into the race or during the race? So,
Ben, are
because
you
you're not trying to consume as
online?
many carbs per hour. Are you talking about lead into the race or during the race, Ben?
You can either
Okay.
type or unmute yourself.
Just unmute yourself, Ben.
Carbs during the race and sodium pre-race.
Well, no, you're not trying to. It depends on. So again, it will depend on what your power output is. So your watts that you produce is a measure of energy. Um, if let's say you're an athlete and you're only producing 120 watts, you don't certainly don't need to be consuming, um, you know, anywhere over 90 grams an hour. And I'd probably argue somewhere around 60 to 70 grams an hour is going to be plenty for you. If you're an athlete who, again, and we talked about this the other day on a Q&A, you can go on YouTube. Alan was talking about it and gave some examples for females and males and what the wattage would be to consider taking on at least 90 grams an hour, upwards up into 120 and 130 and 140 grams an hour. But it is based on you having a significant power output. Well, it's significant and not significant. Yeah, for women, I think it was starting at like 200, something like 200 watts, and for men, it was something like 220 or 230 watts.
Preloading
And
with
it,
sodium is a yes or no?
what's that?
Briefly. Preloading with sodium pre-race.
Preloading with sodium would be something that I would recommend that you practice, but also only really required in very hot environments.
Mhm. Luke from Shell Harbour Tri Club. If doing the heat loading, the prep for hot race, does that change nutrition you should be intaking or just fluids?
Uh, if you're doing the heat loading, does that change? So are you saying when you're practicing that in the 10 days leading up, does that change how you're practicing your nutrition on the bike because of
I
the
believe
heat
so.
loading? So just because you're doing the heat loading wouldn't change necessarily the nutrition that you're doing specifically at that time. But as I was saying, if it is very hot conditions, you need to factor in where are the carbs coming from. So are they coming predominantly from liquid sources? Are they coming from solid sources? Probably a combination of both. The other consideration, which I didn't say, is if it is a very hot race, you probably won't manage to consume as much as you normally would tolerate in a cool race. So you may drop it down by something like 10 or 20 grams an hour and just feel very comfortable knowing that the way in which your body is processing it may not be as efficient as in a cooler race because of blood shunting and stuff like that.
Right.
Does that answer the
Do
question?
we
Okay, cool. Yeah.
do we have anyone else that wants to jump, unmute yourself or type the question into the meeting chat? Just give you a sec, and then if not, we'll have a conversation with Joel and talking a bit more about Fuelin and the platform itself.
Let's get him on. Joel, where are you?
Yep, here, ready to go.
G'day, mate. Oh, it's all squeaky, but mate, congratulations on the race. Well done.
Thanks, Scott.
First pro podium, is that right?
Yes, correct. First professional podium.
It's very good. So, um, I'll give a little bit of. Well, do you want to give a little bit of background, Joel, of why you actually started working with Fuelin and me?
Oh, for probably started working with you. I'm gonna say almost
Do
a
you have
year
a
ago.
Joel? Do you have another microphone? It's just very crackly.
I can try it. Just
Try that. Go now.
is it easier if I just speak
Yeah,
into?
that's better. That's heaps better. Do that.
I probably been working with you, Scott, and Fueling for think about a little over a year now, maybe, and at the time I'd gone down I reached out to you because I'd gone down a rabbit hole of thinking that lighter was faster and basically sort of lost my way with fueling training and had RED-S, which is relative energy deficiency syndrome from being in a low energy availability state for an extended period of time. So I basically had some people around me and also myself recognized I needed help with fueling and nutrition. And I can't remember how I found out about you, but it must have been through maybe Holly Lawrence or one of the initial pro triathletes you had, and reached out to you to see if you'd be able to help and explain my situation. And yeah, since then it's been really helpful. And I think in the last 12 months, I think I've managed to gain about 6 kilos of predominantly muscle mass. My swimming and cycling has gotten a lot better, and then also with that added weight, my running hasn't slowed down, which is often the fear for triathletes, that the extra weight will have an effect on running, but it's been the opposite. I've actually gotten faster at running and had some of my best triathlon performances to date. So that's probably
Yeah,
the version.
and I will. Well, there's a couple of things, Joel. You've actually put on 10 kilos since he started. He was down to 52 kilos at one point in time, which is very, very light. And I just want to emphasize, just to clarify a few things Joel said. He talks about a thing called REDS, which is relative energy deficiency in sport, which is a syndrome underpinned by a state of what we call low energy availability. And to make that very clear, what it means is Joel was not eating enough to support his training. And as a result of that, that will impact many aspects of the human body, but in particular bones. It will impact your hormonal system. It will impact your brain in terms of mood. It will impact your cardiac system, your immune system, pretty much every system in your body. Traditionally, it was only thought to impact women. So you had what was called the female athlete triad, and that was focused very much on the menstrual cycle, energy availability, and bone injuries. But what we do know is that, and the reason the classification changed was that males are just, well, they're not as prone to being susceptible to low energy availability and REDS, but they are. And it's something really we will talk about more, and we do talk about it a lot with Fuelin. But what Joel, when he came to me, he was not in a very healthy way. He was very under fueling, under muscled. Bones had unfortunately taken a bit of a hit, and that was measured via things like bone mineral density scans. And what I want to emphasize here is that when you think you're just losing weight to get faster, the negative consequences of that can be quite dire and very serious. It's not that they can't be overcome. And thankfully, Joel sought help and was very open to getting help, but it is a very serious condition that does affect males and females. And I do want every athlete to be aware of that. Yeah.
Actually, Scott, could
Tom,
you
yeah, go on.
could you go back a few slides, and I'd love to also share personally my experience with Fuelin, and I think Joel can add to that. But if you go back a few slides there, this is the slide where you have the Training Peaks app open and Fuelin, because I'd love to explain to people what I think it's a great app and what I've been using it myself. I've been lucky to use it for about a month now. And so yeah, guys, if you look on the left-hand side, so you can see Training Peaks for those of you that have used the platform, which is a platform used by many coaches and athletes even themselves when they actually put the training on a day-to-day basis. And you can see on that slide that you have a race practice ride at 2 hours and 45 minutes. And then below that, you have a run off the bike for 1 hour and 15. So basically what Fueling does, based on the intensity of the session that you coach as programmed in your Training Peaks Tri-Dot or Final Surge, it would give you the amount of carbs and the amount of fat and protein that you need for those sessions. So what you look at on the second basically screenshot on the phone is the amount that's required for you to basically hit the numbers that the Fueling experts, and Scott is one of the four coaches, I've basically prescribed for you for the session. And on top of that, which I found fascinating for me, that sometimes I've made poor food choices when it comes to what do I need to eat when I finish my ride or when I finish my run. It actually lists a number of options when it comes to food. So you're not just looking at, your pantry, or you're just you go to the supermarket and not knowing what to choose. It actually tells you meals and recommendations of, food that you should be eating based on the session. So that really bridges the gap for people that, keep constantly guessing because they're not sure what they're going to eat, from, I guess, an intensity and fueling perspective, but also allows you to sort of free your mind a little bit and be like, I can pick one of those recipes of one of those options, and it's very easy for me to make rather than, pulling something out of nowhere. So This has been my experience so far of using Fuelin is that recommendation in terms of, the carbs, fat, and protein, but also that recommendation of the meal. Would you say, Scott, that's kind of like what really athletes love about the platform in terms of how simple it is to use and sort of get that, live
Yeah.
feedback of what you need?
Yeah. I mean, I think you did a very good job at describing it. I mean, yes, we do recommend macronutrients and total calories, and they're, um, on a day-to-day basis, every meal and every snack is laid out. But there are options that are given to you. I think the other thing that I really want to emphasize is that at this point in time, and it is something we're looking at, is we don't actually provide you with a meal plan. Because the idea when we started this, or when I started it, was that I don't want people set with a rigid meal plan that, yes, you can do for a week or 2 weeks. And then lo and behold, you don't have the chicken in your fridge on Tuesday night. And oh God, I'm meant to be cooking chicken with broccoli and I don't have that. Or bad example, chicken and broccoli, but
Mm.
chicken cacciatore, because that's on your meal plan and you don't have the ingredients. So everything goes out the window. It just, you can go through and you can press on it. It gives you the recommendations there, but you have the flexibility based on what you're eating and just logging that to gradually build out the rings or the target that you're aiming for. And now that we have what we call Scooter, which is an AI food tracker, you can simply talk to Scooter, talk or type, and log whatever you're eating. And that will simply log the meal, macronutrients and calories at that time for that meal, and then track that against what your targets are. So yes, you can actually eat whatever you want. And as long as you're going very close to those targets, then you can just go about your life. So I'm a big believer in nutrition not being a diet, but actually more a lifestyle, and you understanding and gradually improving that nutrition intake over time to understand what, improving diet quality, but it has to fit your lifestyle. It is no good giving you a restrictive diet that you can do for a short period of time, but ultimately leaves you feeling very flat. So it is about, as much as anything, habit building. Habits take around 90 days to build. So you increasing your amount of protein, and I can guarantee that the amount of protein that we generally recommend is a lot higher than the average athlete will, or the average person eats on a daily basis. That will have a significant impact on your recovery and the way in which you can attack training on a week-to-week basis. But building in the habits to hit that protein amount takes time. You won't nail it in week one. It will take time. And Joel, again, like talking to Joel and working with Joel, it's taken him time to learn to eat the amount. And he eats a lot of food. He's a smaller guy, yes, 62 kilos, but I'm just looking at his plan. I don't know how you went today, Joel, but he's eating on a rest day, he's eating sort of 350 to 400 grams of carbs during high,
So
high,
Joel,
high levels of training. Yeah. Sorry, go on.
Joel, is that what you do every morning? You sort of like you've got obviously the program from your coach, but then you just log into Fuelin and check already what's happening in terms of the macro for the day. Is that sort of like your first thing in the morning type thing?
Yeah, exactly. When I wake up, I typically eat the same thing before a first training session most days, and then I just will check Fuelin and adjust the quantity to fit the macros to make sure I'm fueled for the session. And it's also not about just fueling that the first session in the morning, but how you feel that first session has a roll-on effect to how you feel in the afternoon session. So I know one of the changes I made with Scott was having carbs before that first session. And previously I wouldn't eat anything before the morning training session, and I'd always get through that morning session fine. So you'd think that there'd be no problem. But then by the time you're doing a second session in the afternoon, it catches up with you, and the quality of that second session isn't as good. Or maybe you're lucky enough that you do get through that second session, but I guarantee you the following day definitely won't be as good. It catches up. And then I think the changes you'll make with Fuelin, don't expect to feel anything significantly change like immediately. It's about, like what Scott said, putting in those habits in place. And when you do it for 90 days or more, then you really start to notice a difference in your performance and your training and everything. So
It's very much
Yeah,
like training. It's
well said.
consistency, spending time training, but also looking at the app and referencing what you should be doing. And I think I guess, key topic that we have talked about a little bit, but it's the hydration part. I know for myself, if I can take myself as an example, I tend to forget to drink. Probably I drink a lot less than I should, and so in the Fuelin app, there's always that sort of reminder that you should hydrate yourself at a certain level. So that also kind of prompts you to, get that extra glass of water, get that extra juice, get the extra Coke, or whatever you want to hydrate yourself. And then the final part, I suppose, is it's already in your training peak, so or you platform for training, so you basically already know what you should be hitting in terms of numbers there. So guys, New South Wales try 30. Thank you, Scott, for that. I didn't know that was coming. So if you still listening on the call, we'll share this promo code around to all the New South Wales members, but you can test the platform yourself with the 30% off. And yeah, I personally highly recommend it. And looking forward to sort of days in and days out, like you mentioned, Joel, to sort of spend a bit of time, keep checking it and see how the progress go over the next sort of few months. So
Yeah, look, I mean, all these things, typical Aussies. I mean, look, the reality is the company is mainly in America at the moment, and for whatever reason, Americans are very open to being coached, and Aussies are always a little reluctant. So, look, I appreciate that this probably comes off a little salesy, and I guess in the end, it is a business, but underlying it all is a team of great nutrition experts who are, I believe, delivering the best possible nutrition product to athletes. And it's with athletes and with the feedback from athletes that we continue to improve this. And, like I love working with athletes like Joel. And I think that the best thing about working with Joel is that it's not just his performance that's improved, it's his actual health. And I think that's, whenever you see that in an athlete and you see their health improve, it's probably why we do what we do. So I thank you for the time on a Wednesday night, listening to me for an hour talk. But if anyone wants to reach out, look, you can it's just scott@fuelin.com if you want to email me. Check out the website, have a look, play around, talk to Joel. Joel's on Instagram. You can pester him. Yeah, and we are actually, Dr. Alan McCubbin and I are doing an Instagram live tomorrow. I think it's at 10 a.m. Sydney time. It's all about higher carb intake. And to that question, I think by Luke Jones about how much should we be taking, we are definitely going to cover that, and we will give the specific examples around energy output in terms of bike wattage and also run speed relative to duration and when you could consider taking on 90 grams or more, which is very fascinating. So we'll go through the science in that. It's always a good listen. Alan's a pretty amazing guy, definitely a lot smarter than me. And we'll go from there. Anyway,
and then yeah, if you have 10 minutes, recommend watching the interview of Jan Frodeno and Scott. A lot of really, if you're a big fan of Jan, I really highly recommend it. It's a 15-minute video, I think, and it's
yeah, just
just
go
a
to
lot of
our YouTube channel and have a look.
YouTube.
He's a good guy and he's funny, and we're going to
Yeah,
do a lot more of those videos. So stay tuned for them as well. So
awesome.
yeah, and
But
we're on Instagram. We always push out a lot of good information that you can use. So if you just search Get Fuelin, so GETFUELIN, you'll see us. And yeah, as I say, there's lots of good information there that can get you going immediately without using the app.
awesome.
Cool.
Well, thanks for your
Thank,
time, Scott,
thanks,
Joel,
Tom.
and good luck to all the athletes that are competing again at the Ironman of 70.3 in Port
Yeah, best
Macquarie.
of
Looking
luck.
forward to seeing you there, and then club champs in a few weeks. Speak
Best of
soon.
luck, everyone. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Like,
Thanks, Joel.
let's go.